My name is Tahir Kılavuz. I'm an assistant professor at Marmara University in the Faculty of Political Sciences. Welcome to the seventh installment of the ILEM Istanbul Talks. We are with Professor Asma Afsaruddin today, and we are going to have a talk on titled Negotiations of the Multiple Meanings of Jihad Concerning Pre-Modern and Modern Hermeneutics. So our talk will be about 50 minutes, and then hopefully we are going to have a question and answer session. Before we start our conversation with Dr. Afsaruddin, let me introduce her to you briefly. Dr. Afsaruddin is a professor of Islamic Studies in the Department of Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures in the Indiana University, Bloomington. She received her PhD from Johns Hopkins University, and then she taught at Harvard and Notre Dame. Her research interests include Islamic religious and political thought, both in the modern era and the pre-modern era, as well as Islamic intellectual history, Quran, Hadith, and interfaith relations, as well as gender in Islam. She's the author and editor of multiple volumes, including Striving in the Path of God, Jihad and Martyrdom in the Islamic Thought, Contemporary Issues in Islam, and Jihad, What Everyone Needs to Know, her recent book that we are going to discuss to some extent today. And also, she has a forthcoming volume on the Oxford Handbook of Islam and Women, that's coming up in 2023. We really appreciate that Dr. Afsaruddin is with us today, and I would like to welcome you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Ramadan Mubarak to everybody. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of the conference, particularly Dr. Kılavuz, for inviting me to give this lecture today. And I want to thank everyone in the audience as well for attending today. So let me begin by very briefly talking about the Arabic word jihad and the several phrases and expressions that are associated with it in key foundational Islamic texts. And can we now show the handout, the first page of the handout, please? There, thank you very much. So, as I hope is well known, the Arabic word jihad in its fundamental sense refers to struggle, exertion, and effort. The frequently encountered phrase al-jihād fi sabīlillah therefore broadly means struggling or striving in the path of God. It is, however, commonly assumed in many circles in the West, including in the Western Academy, that jihad refers exclusively to fighting and is inevitably aggressive in nature. After all, militant groups claiming to carry out their violent activities in the name of Islam are very much in the news, and they label their actions as jihad. The Western media dutifully calls such groups jihadist, as do policymakers and opinion shapers of all kinds. The average person consuming the daily news cannot help but be convinced that jihad is indeed the term for unprincipled violence that Muslims are required to engage in throughout the world. As a result of such extensive media coverage, there are three popular and erroneous misperceptions of jihad that have become quite prevalent in the Western Academy and beyond. These misperceptions are often predicated on the following three assumptions. First, jihad is relentless, bloody warfare to be waged by Muslims en masse against non-Muslims en masse until Islam occupies the whole world or till the end of time, whichever occurs first. Second, Muslims can issue the call to such a jihad anytime and anyhow, and their only excuse is that stubborn unbelievers will not submit willingly or unwillingly at their hands. And third, when Muslims argue that a true military jihad is only defensive and conditional, while the internal non-violent jihad is continuous and unconditional. They are deliberately dissembling about the real nature of jihad and are to be regarded as apologists for their faith. It is not only anti-Islamic websites that list such perceptions of jihad. Popular media and mainstream publications frequently convey approximate versions of the above and contribute to the formation of such views. Militant Islamist websites and print literature reinforce such ideas. More sophisticated and better informed sources will often refer to the greater and lesser jihad as indicating the distinction between the internal spiritual versus the external physical jihad and the greater importance of the former. However, the assertion that Muslims as a collectivity must continue to wage a military jihad against non-Muslims in order to expand Muslim realms while observing humanitarian codes of conduct against civilians is more or less accepted as a given, even by many specialists of Islam. The proof texts invoked in support of such a position are medieval Islamic legal texts, which frequently did list such a requirement as part of the duties of the Muslim ruler. And this is where we must start to trace the rise of certain truisms about the nature and purview of the military jihad. Privileging the legal literature above other kinds of literature, particularly the exegetical literature or the commentaries on the Qur'an, and ethical treatises in discussions of jihad, almost inevitably leads to the conclusion that it is primarily a collective military obligation incumbent upon able-bodied Muslim men in the service of state and religion. And because what we call Islamic law is assumed to be derived directly from the Qur'an and the Hadith, Hadith, of course, referring to the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, such an obligation is assumed to be mandated by Islam itself. But if you go back to the Qur'an and plumb the earliest exegetical texts, Hadith collections, and edifying literary works which stressed ethical and moral concerns above all, a considerably different picture emerges. The earliest connotations of jihad had to do with patient forbearance. In Arabic, the term is sabr. Such patient forbearance is meant to be exercised in the face of harm and represented stoic, non-violent resistance to wrongdoing. After the famous emigration known as the Hijrah to Medina from his birthplace, Mecca, the Prophet Muhammad received divine permission to fight in self-defense, according to Qur'an 22:39 through 40, lifting the earlier prohibition against fighting. Muslims, after all, had been physically and verbally attacked for publicly practicing their religion and driven out of their homes unjustly. These revelations allowed them to fight back, but only to the extent that they had been harmed. The two verses in Qur'an 22:39 through 40 state, in English translation, permission is given to those who are fought against or against whom fighting has been initiated, yuqataluna, because they have been wronged or oppressed, and God is able to help them. These are they who have been wrongfully expelled from their homes, merely for saying, God is our Lord. If God had not restrained some people by means of others, monasteries, churches, synagogues, and mosques, in which God's name is mentioned frequently, would have been destroyed. Indeed, God comes to the aid of those who come to his aid. Verily, he is powerful and mighty. End of quote. It should be noted that the Arabic uses the passive verb yuqataluna instead of the active yuqatiluna in Qur'an 22:39. The verse therefore clearly refers to fighting back once one has been attacked. Recourse to defensive fighting was established in these verses for Muslims, not for the sake of propagating religion, but for the protection of their lives and property, as well as potentially those of non-Muslim monotheists who faced similar persecution, since Christian and Jewish houses of worship are clearly mentioned in Qur'an 22:39 through 40 as being worthy of protection. Another critical verse, Qur'an 2:190, unambiguously forbids Muslims from attacking the enemy first. The verse states, "Fight in the way of God those who fight you, and do not commit aggression. Accordingly, early exegetes in particular insisted that Muslims could only fight back after they had been attacked, no ifs or buts, and that the counterattack had to be proportional to the original attack. This is the documented position of the early exegetes Mujahid ibn Jabr. He died in 104 of the Hijri era, or 722 of the Gregorian era. And Muqatil ibn Sulayman died 150 or 767, who wrote the Qur'an commentaries during the Umayyad period. These early positions continued to be maintained by later exegetes, such as the late 12th century exegete Fakhr al-Razi, who died in 606 or 1210. Similar reasons, which legitimate an armed response to the adversary, are contained in another important group of verses in Quran 9, 12 through 13, which state, if they break their pacts, aymanahum in Arabic, after having concluded them and revile your religion, then fight the leaders of unbelief. Will you not fight a people who violated their oaths and had intended to expel the messenger and began hostilities against you the first time? The overwhelming majority of exegetes stress that the violation of pacts by the polytheists, their denigration of Islam, hostile intent toward the Prophet, and their initial act of aggression towards Muslims had made fighting necessary against them. In his commentary in Quran 9:12, the famous late 3rd or 9th century exegete from the Abbasid period, Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari, who died in 310 or 923, says that it is a critique of those from among the tribe of Quraysh who had violated the terms of their pact with the Prophet, according to which they had agreed not to fight the Muslims nor provide aid to their enemies. Another verse, Quran 475, exhorts Muslims to defend militarily those who are among the feeble of men and of women and children who cry out, our Lord, deliver us from this town in which the people are oppressors. In the understanding of some pre-modern jurists, this verse establishes humanitarian reasons for military intervention to aid those who are defenseless against their oppressors and who specifically call upon Muslims to provide them with help. A point that has been stressed in modern juridical discourses, for example, in the writings of the Syrian jurist Wahba al-Zuhaili and the Egyptian jurist Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Some scholars were also of the opinion that the Quranic command to fight was only applicable to the first generation of Muslims who were contemporaries of the Prophet Muhammad, known as the companions, since the historical referent in the verses that deal with fighting are the hostile pagan Arabs of Mecca. One verse in Quran 2:16 that is often cited in many sources as establishing the obligatory nature of fighting states, quoting, fighting has been prescribed for you, even though you find it displeasing. Perhaps you dislike something in which there is good for you, and perhaps you find pleasing that which causes you harm. But God knows, and you do not. End of quote. There is no doubt that according to this verse and other verses, when war is duly constituted for justified and legitimate reasons, among which are the violation of treaties by the enemy and their initiation of hostilities, fighting becomes a moral obligation which no adult male believer may shirk without extenuating reason. However, the exegetes differed as to who exactly were intended in the Arabic plural you, kum, in the verse. In Arabic, it states, kutiba alaykum al-qital. In other words, fighting has been prescribed for you. According to early sources, such as the late 3rd, 9th century Quran commentary of al-Tabari, the early pious Medinan scholar Ata ibn Abi Rabah was prominent among those who subscribed to the position that fighting was prescribed only during the time of the Prophet. In the 11th century, another Quran exegete, al-Wahidi, who died in 468 or 1076, continues to endorse this early position that fighting was a religiously prescribed duty only during the lifetime of the Prophet, as did Fakhr al-Razi in the late 12th century. In addition to stating who can be fought against and for what reasons, the Quran also unambiguously refers to those who cannot be fought against. Thus, in several verses, the Quran states that Muslims cannot fight non-Muslims who are peaceful and show no hostile intent towards them. One verse, Quran 490, states, "If they hold themselves aloof from you and do not wage war against you and offer you peace, then God does not permit you any way against them." End of quote. Two significant verses from Quran 60, chapter 60, verses 8 to 9, mandate kind and just interactions with those who are peaceful, regardless of their religious beliefs, in contrast to those who willfully commit aggression. These verses state, "God does not forbid you from being kind and equitable to those who have neither made war on you on account of your religion, nor driven you from your homes. Indeed, God loves those who are equitable and just. God forbids you, however, from making common cause with those who fight you on account of your religion and evict you from your homes and who support others in driving you out." End of quote. Al-Tabari, in his exegesis, emphasizes that these verses clearly permit Muslims to be kind to all those who bear no ill will toward them, regardless of their religion and creed. Al-Razi also stresses that this verse makes evident that kindness and charity are permissible between polytheists and Muslims, but disallows military alliances. Above all, Al-Razi says, Muslims must behave justly with non-Muslims, whether they are kinsfolk or not, and honor their agreements with them. Another important verse, Quran 8:61, warns that should the adversary refrain from fighting and incline towards peace, Muslims had to reciprocate. Quran 8:61 is therefore the quintessential verse concerning peacemaking. It states in full, quoting, "And if they should incline to peace, then incline to it yourself, and place your trust in God, for he is all-hearing and all-knowing." End of quote. Al-Tabari says that God in this verse addresses the Prophet and counsels him that should the enemy incline to making peace with you and abandon warfare, either through entry into Islam or payment of the jizya, the so-called poll tax, or through the establishment of friendly relations, muwada'a, then you should do the same for the sake of peace and peacemaking. Can we now go ahead and scroll down to the next page on the handout? It should be page 2, if we just scroll down. So as one might imagine, yes, did that go through?
Yeah, I guess there, you have to scroll down. And while we are waiting for that, I would also like to remind the viewers that they can submit their questions. They can like type their questions either on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, wherever they watch, and hopefully at the end I will ask the questions. And I guess they scroll down, so please continue. Thanks.
Okay. So as one might imagine, such Quranic verses which limited warfare to defensive fighting and commanded desisting from violence when the other side did, were an obstacle to the process of empire building. By Umayyad times, that is by the late 7th through the early 8th century, the need was soon felt in official and certain legal circles to promote the military jihad as a religiously meritorious activity to allow for the expansion, the territorial expansion of the Islamic Empire after the death of the Prophet Muhammad during the late 7th and 8th centuries of the Common Era. Certain scholars, such as the Syrian scholar Makhul al-Shami, and he died roughly 119 of the Hijri era or 737 in the Gregorian calendar, Makhul al-Shami framed realpolitik concerns focused on security and territorial expansion in overtly religious idiom and sought to create theological imperatives for fighting on behalf of empire. The progressive watering down in later exegetical and legal literature of the Quranic prohibition against initiating hostilities is revealing of the triumph of political realism over scriptural fidelity. This trend became quite prominent by the 9th century during the Abbasid period with its imperial ambitions, as may be detected in a number of legal works from the period. The well-known Abbasid jurist Ash-Shafi'i was also a member of this school of political realism. It is from this vantage point that Ash-Shafi'i divided the world into the abode of Islam, Darul Islam, versus the abode of war, Darul Harb in Arabic, with an intervening abode of truce, Darul Ahad or Sulh, into which non-Muslim nations could enter by signing treaties of coexistence with the Muslim polity. None of the foundational texts of Islam, either the Qur'an or the Hadith literature, refer to such a division of the world. But ever the pragmatist, this is how Ash-Shafi'i made sense of the conflict-ridden world of his time. He was also of the opinion that the caliph should carry out offensive military campaigns against non-Muslim polities as part of his role as defender of Islamic realms. Such offensive military activity was included by him under the rubric of jihad and justified as a necessary moral preemptive course of action against a hostile enemy such as the Byzantines. Ironically, thanks to his efforts, the military jihad thus became inextricably linked to the secular project of empire building and expansion, although secular nature was convincingly concealed within a carefully crafted religious idiom. A diachronic comparison of early and late texts that discuss jihad affirms, however, the variable trajectory of this term and indicates the moral and legal contestations of its multiple meanings by different groups of people in different historical periods. This becomes particularly evident when we further survey religious, edifying, and what today we might call self-improvement literature that emphasizes ethical imperatives more than legal and statist concerns. Thus, the famous mystical theologian of the late 11th century, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, he died in 505 in the Hijri era, or 1111 according to the Gregorian calendar. Al-Ghazali, in his celebrated work on ethics and morality, which is titled in English, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, in Arabic, Ihya Ulumuddin, emphasizes the internal and spiritual dimensions of jihad that are of greater importance for the individual. The external battle between the forces of good and evil, which will persist until the last times, has been completely internalized by al-Ghazali and transferred to the battleground of the human heart. Lest one think that only Muslim mystics place such stress on the internal jihad, as is sometimes dismissively asserted, it is useful to reference the views of a prominent Hanbali jurist from the 15th century, the 8th century, from the 14th century, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya, who died in 751 or 1350, who was a student of another famous Hanbali jurist, Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 728 or 1328. In an ethical treatise, Ibn Qayyim mirrors the views of al-Ghazali to a considerable extent by praising those who constantly practice the internal self-purification required of a holistic jihad, and who thereby, now I'm quoting from him, strive with regard to God in true striving. And this is a reference to Qur'an 2278. Like al-Ghazali, he does not devalue the external combative or military jihad when and where there is a need for it, but regards engaging in the internal jihad as encapsulated by the term sabr, which I'm translating as patient forbearance, as the best of all deeds under all circumstances. The belligerent juridical perspective that gained ground from the 9th century onward relies for its validity on the invocation of the hermeneutic principle of abrogation that emerged over time. a principle that is known in Arabic as naskh. According to a considerable number of scholars, the principle of abrogation allows for a number of early Quranic verses, which are markedly irenic and conciliatory in tone, to be superseded by later ones which deal with fighting those who had attacked and persecuted Muslims for their faith alone. It is this theory of abrogation which has allowed for an expansionist conception of the military jihad to emerge in deference to realpolitik. Thus, the first part of the Quranic verse 9:5, which states, quoting, "When the sacred months have lapsed, then slay the polytheists wherever you may find them," end of quote, is invoked by a number of pre-modern exegetes as having abrogated Quran 2:190 with its no aggression clause. This verse, 9:5, referred to in the later literature as ayatus sayf, or the sword verse, is also assumed by some to have abrogated Quran 60 from chapter 60 verses 8-9, which call for kind and just behavior to be extended to those who live peacefully with Muslims, as well as our quintessential peacemaking verse, Quran 8:61. However, it should be noted that not all exegetes were of one mind on this issue. Some of the most influential Quran commentators of the pre-modern period asserted instead that these verses remained unabrogated and valid for all time. Al-Tabari, for example, dismisses the suggestions of others that Quran 60, 8-9 are abrogated, since that would lead to the assumption that peaceful people can be attacked on the basis of their religion and not for their aggression. That would be unjust and therefore not permissible. For At-Tabari says, and here I'm quoting directly, "God loves those who are equitable, who give people their due rights, are personally just to them, and do good to those who are good to them." End of quote. These views were repeated by practically all the exegetes who came after him. Among the later exegetes, the 13th century Andalusian exegete al-Qurtubi, he died in 671 or 1273, he is the most adamant in maintaining that the exhortation in Quran 68 to be kind to those who had caused Muslims no harm was applicable to everyone who belonged in this category, regardless of their religious affiliation, and that the command was unambiguous and valid, muhkama, for all time. Similarly, with regard to Quran 8:61, At-Tabari says that the position of those who maintain that the peacemaking verse Quran 8:61 had been abrogated by Quran 9:5, the so-called sword verse, cannot be supported on the basis of the Quran, the Sunnah, or reason. At-Tabari's was not a minority position. After him, a Zamakhshari from the mid-6th of the Hijri era or the mid-12th century in the Gregorian calendar, and then after him, al-Razi from the late 12th century, and Ibn Kathir, who died in 774 or 1373, during the Mamluk period, continued to assert that Quran 8:61 remained an unabrogated verse, and its mandate for establishing peace was normative and binding for all time. Let me now bring all of us into the modern period and talk about some of the exegeses of these verses by modern scholars. So in the context of European colonization during the 19th century and the early 20th century, of a broad swath of the Muslim majority world, jihad as defensive war made a comeback among certain Muslim scholars and jurists. During the colonial period, the emphasis was on jihad as a righteous and legitimate struggle against foreign aggressors. Certain verses taken from the 9th chapter of the Quran were often deployed to exhort Muslims to defend themselves against their foreign occupiers. At the same time, there was renewed critique by reformist scholars of some of the classical legal positions concerning the military jihad that were understood to represent deviations from Quranic ethics on warfare. The well-known Egyptian reformer and scholar Muhammad Abduh from the late 19th century placed renewed stress on the defensive nature of the military jihad, as was clearly the position in the very early period, as we noted. Therefore, Abduh emphasized that Quran 2:190 allowed fighting, quoting now from him, as defense in the path of God, so as to allow unimpeded worship of him in his house, end of quote, and as a warning against those who break their pacts and seek to entice Muslims away from their faith. The Arabic command in Quran 2:190, وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا, do not commit aggression, is interpreted by him to contain both a proscription against initiation of hostilities by Muslims and attacking traditional non-combatants, such as women, children, the elderly, the infirm, or in those who are ill, and those who offer you peace. Additionally, he noted, it prohibits causing destruction to crops and property. Abduh furthermore rejects the interpretation that the so-called sword verse, Quran 9:5, had abrogated the more numerous verses in the Quran which called for forgiveness and peaceful relations with non-Muslims. Citing the views of the late 15th century scholar Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, he died in 911 or 1505, Abduh argues that in the specific historical situation with which the verse is concerned, with its internal reference to the passage of the 4 sacred months and to the pagan Meccans, other verses in the Quran advocating forgiveness and nonviolence are not abrogated. The command contained in Quran 9:5, Abduh says, was in response to a specific situation at a specific time in order to achieve a specific objective and has no effect on the general injunction contained in, for example, Quran 2:109 from chapter 2, verse 109, which states, pardon and forgive until God brings about his command, end of quote, which Abduh notes is in regard to a different set of circumstances and objectives. Abduh is critical of those who would see the injunction contained in Quran 9:5 with its clear reference to Arab polytheists applicable in any way to non-Arab polytheists or to the people of the book, the Ahlul Kitab, which is a reference to primarily Jews and Christians. He points out that the people of the book are referred to very differently in the Quran, as in Quran 5:82, chapter 5, verse 82, which states, quote, you will find the closest in affection to those who believe are those who say, we are Christians, end of quote. And also in hadiths, such as the one which counsels leaving the Ethiopians as well as Turks alone, as long as they leave the Muslims alone. Abduh laments the fact that if jurists had not read these verses and hadiths, what he describes as from behind the veil of their juridical schools, end of quote, then they would not have so egregiously missed the fundamental point made throughout the Quran and in sound hadiths that, quoting now again from Abduh, the security to be obtained through fighting the Arab polytheists, according to these verses, is contingent upon their initiating attacks against Muslims and violating their treaties, end of quote. Abduh goes on to point out that the very next verse, Quran 9:6, offers protection and safe conduct to those among the polytheists who wish to listen to the Quran peacefully. The implication is clear. Polytheists and non-Muslims in general who do not wish Muslims harm and display no aggression toward them are to be left alone and allowed to continue in their ways of life. Several modern Muslim scholars have similarly undertaken a sustained critique of a number of positions adopted by the classical jurists, particularly on the issue of whether it is ever permissible to initiate an attack on an adversary by resorting to a close reading of the Qur'an and other very early sources. Their main area of contention is with the later exegetical and juridical position, which viewed lack of adherence to Islam rather than aggression as the reason for launching the military jihad. This perspective, which relies on the invocation of the principle of naskh, or abrogation, for its validity, has been severely criticized by a variety of modern and contemporary Muslim scholars. And they include Subhi Mahmasani, Ali Jum, Abu Zahra, Wahba al-Zuhaili, and others. These scholars have emphasized instead that the Quran should be read holistically, and that the critical verses which forbid the initiation of war by Muslims and which uphold the principle of non-coercion in religion, non-compulsion in religion, as stated in Quran 2:256, chapter 2, verse 256, categorically militate against the conception of an offensive jihad to be waged against non-Muslims as non-Muslims. Needless to say, militants in the modern period favor the pro-abrogation position because it allows them to wield the so-called sword verse, Quran 9:5, ahistorically and arbitrarily to justify their campaign of violent vengeance. Thus, in the 20th century, extremist tract titled Al-Farida al-Ghaiba, the neglected duty, its author, Muhammad Abduh Faraj, a member of the extremist Egyptian group al-Jihad that carried out the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat in 1981, appeals to the abrogating function of Quran 9:5 vis-a-vis all other conciliatory verses in the Quran to justify their actions. It furthermore invokes the situation in extremis argument, which in Faraj's opinion grants him and his fellow militants considerable license in the means they adopt in carrying out their violent mission. These militants, in turn, have been criticized by modern mainstream scholars. The Egyptian scholar Muhammad Imara, in his refutation of Abdus Faraj's work, criticized Faraj's use of the so-called sword verse as one that abrogates all other verses of forbearance, sabr, forgiveness, al-afu, pardon, as-safh, and turning away, al-i'rad. He states that the author ignores the fact that the verse was revealed specifically concerning the polytheists of the 7th century, the al-mushrikun, and that it has nothing to do with any other group of people or religious community. By doing so, he says, they are guilty of deliberately distorting the meaning of Quran 9:5. He points out that the well-known pre-modern scholar Jalaluddin as-Suyuti had unambiguously stated that the Ayatul Sayf did not abrogate verses like Quran 2:109, which states, "Forgive and pardon them until God decides the matter," end of quote, a verse that advises Muslims to forgive those who do them wrong. Imara stresses that the rest of the 9th chapter, Surah At-Tawbah, unambiguously upholds these fundamental Quranic principles. First, recourse to armed combat on the part of Muslims is conditional on prior aggression by the polytheists, and he reminds that this is the only group referenced in the chapter. And second, that fighting is a response to their hostile violation of their pacts with Muslims. Imara explains the term jihad as referring to the exertion of one's utmost ability and effort in order to defend oneself against enemies in the different spheres of life. And these enemies include one's own base thoughts and inclinations to material acquisitiveness, as well as external enemies who threaten your well-being. Another prominent modern scholar similarly emphasized a holistic understanding of jihad as a general effort made by humans in every sphere of life. This is Ali Jum, who was the Grand Mufti of Egypt between 2003 and 2013, and professor of Islamic jurisprudence at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt. In the aftermath of the September 11 attacks, Jum wrote an important book in 2005 entitled al-Jihād fil Islam, or in translation, Jihad in Islam. Among other topics, he discusses the legitimate objectives of warfare in Islam. And he says these include to repel aggression and to defend oneself, and secondly, to aid truth and justice. Jum stresses that a number of conditions and restrictions are to be strictly enforced when waging war. These include observance of clear, honorable rules of conduct with regard to means and objectives. Second, prohibition against fighting non-combatants and avoidance of aggression against civilians. Third, cessation of hostilities, ending hostilities when the opposite camp inclines to peace and refrains from fighting, except in the case of those who persist in wrongdoing or oppression. Illa ala dhalimin. Fourth, protection and humane treatment of prisoners of war. Fifth, protection of the environment. Under this proviso, animals must not be killed except for an expressly beneficial purpose. Trees may not be cut down, nor may crops and fruit-bearing trees be laid waste. Wells and water in general may not be polluted, and houses may not be destroyed. And finally, sixth, protection of the lives and property of religious functionaries like monks and hermits, who cannot be harmed in their monasteries and cells when peacefully practicing their religion. Jum anticipates a question that may be posed to Muslims today. What is their argument to those who point out that most nations agree that conflicts between them are better adjudicated today through arbitration, rendering wars null and void? Whereas, he's continuing this rhetorical question, whereas this Quran of yours exhorts you to jihad and to undertake it eagerly. The answer would be, Jum says, we, Muslims, marshal as our proof text in this age the Almighty's words. If they should incline to peace, then incline to it also, and place your trust in God, for he is the all-hearing and all-knowing. Again, this is, of course, a reference to Quran 861. This verse, Jum says, indicates the eternal wisdom and abiding miracle of the Quran, in that it foresaw a future world where global nonviolence was a possibility. Jum therefore suggests that the combative jihad was necessary for self-defense in a pre-modern war-ridden world. Against such a historical backdrop, the Quran and the Sunnah permitted fighting out of necessity while imposing humane and ethical restrictions on waging war. In the modern world, governed, at least theoretically, by international treaties and contracts, Quran 861 is the more appropriate proof text to be invoked in mandating peaceful relationships among humans and nations. In conclusion, then, this quick survey of the writings of a number of influential Muslim scholars allows us to draw a number of conclusions regarding the historical trajectory of jihad that have profound implications for the contemporary period. First, it documents the multiple meanings of jihad that are prevalent in the literature, particularly outside the legal sphere, and challenges a monolithic, reductive understanding of the term. Second, it establishes the defensive and limited nature of fighting in the Quran, as stressed particularly by exegetes, ethicists, and moral theologians. The military jihad is most categorically not holy war in the Quran, since it is not fought for religious reasons, but for defense against violent persecution by others for professing monotheism, and therefore can be fought to protect not only persecuted Muslims, but also persecuted Jews, Christians, and other believers, as clearly stated in Qur'an 22:39. Third, it contextualizes the legal positions that legitimized offensive military activity as contingent responses to specific historical circumstances, which cannot therefore be deemed to be normatively binding for Muslims for all times and for all places. Through a close reading of scripture and the historical contextualization of later literary productions, which chart the storied history of jihad, fundamental Islamic perspectives on peace and war are thus discovered to be closely aligned with modern international norms of waging war and making peace. Consultation of a broad repertoire of diverse sources allows us to better comprehend the circumstances which allowed for the historical transformation of the Quranic defensive jihad into offensive imperial warfare at the hands of some jurists. Above all, it allows all to credibly and cogently challenge the views touted in extremist literature produced by both militant Islamist groups and Islamophobes today, that military activity masquerading as cosmic holy war is the primary and most authentic meaning of the complex and multivalent Arabic term, jihad. Thank you very much for listening.
Sure. Thank you very much, Dr. Afsaruddin. This was a fantastic summary of, or the explanation of the concept of jihad. I actually had a couple of questions to ask you in mind, but you gave a very comprehensive talk. You pretty much answered most of my questions during your presentation, so it was pretty good. So we can now open the discussion to questions that we can receive from the audience. In the meantime, I still have a couple of questions to pose to you. While we're waiting for a couple of questions from them, let me ask one thing to you first. First of all, I would like to say that just like your talk today, your recent book is a great book as well. I recommend everyone to read that. So I had a chance to read several chapters. So you, just like you did here, you step by step go through different aspects of jihad from the Quran and then to hadith, and then in fiqh, in Sufi literature, and then you bring it to the modern era as you did in your talk. So while reading through and also listening to your talk here, there was one thing that I realized. So when we try to explain the concept of jihad, both to ourselves and especially to a non-Muslim audience, in response to this jihad as a holy war concept, we try to say that there is this spiritual jihad and then jihad as a defense or jihad as a war. And we say like the lesser jihad versus greater jihad, etc. So you obviously emphasize that as well, and you
I lost the audio.
Is it good now?
Yes, now I can hear you, but I didn't hear the last.
My AirPods went off for a second. Sorry. So you give reference to the spiritual jihad in your book, and you gave reference here as well. But one thing that I realized that you're not taking a defensive position by overemphasizing the spiritual aspect of jihad. You're not saying that, oh, this is a Sufi thing. You're saying that jihad is related with war and peace, but it's not just, it's just not the holy war that is touted by more radical views. So you clearly emphasize that it's about war, it's about defending. So my question is actually about this. So when you go through the exegeses and fiqh, do you find that this emphasis has been much more common than the spiritual aspect, or like, do you think that like the Sufi literature is not balancing the maybe like the more state-oriented fiqh literature?
So if I understood your question correctly, you're asking me if I look at the fiqh literature, do I see a similar emphasis on the non-military aspects of jihad?
No. What I'm asking is, so in your talk, there was more emphasis on the military version of jihad, more than the spiritual version. Yeah. Is this more common in the classical literature, both in fiqh literature and Sufi literature? That's what I'm asking.
So it depends on which sources you look at. So you said you've been looking at my current book, The Jihad, What Everyone Needs to Know. If you go to the 3rd chapter, which deals with the legal literature, I make it very clear that depending on what sources you look at, you will find different dimensions of jihad being stressed in these sources. So moral theologians, ethicists, those who wrote edifying literature, in other words, to improve yourself as a human being, they emphasized, of course, the non-combative aspects of jihad. And one of the terms that's associated with jihad, and which I stress in my writings, is the notion of sabr, which is patient forbearance. And that is an aspect of jihad. That is the internal, largely non-combative aspect or dimension of jihad. So in the later literature, we have the development of the terminology greater versus lesser jihad, or the jihad al-nafs, the spiritual jihad, versus the jihad al-sayf, which is the military jihad. These terms, this terminology, this typology of jihad does not exist in the early period, because the words that were actually used for the internal jihad, the spiritual jihad, is sabr. It's derived straight from the Qur'an, right? The Qur'an actually lays great emphasis on sabr. This is the aspect of human struggle that has to be carried out all the time. Now, if someone attacks you militarily and you are being aggressed against, the Quran also gives you permission to defend yourself militarily. But it's only under those conditions. It's a limited, conditional activity when you can resort to military activity. The jurists, especially the state jurists, their main concern was guaranteeing the security of Muslim lands. So for them, jihad was primarily military in nature. That does not mean the jurists did not recognize that there were other dimensions of jihad. But the dimension of jihad that they had to write about, that they made legal pronouncements on, by necessity, had to be issues concerned with state security. So I gave the example of Ibn Qayyim, who was a jurist, a Hanbali jurist, studied with Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah often gets a bad rap in the sources. I think he's made out to be far more militant than he actually is. If you read his, the whole gamut of his writings, it's a misrepresentation, I think, of his ideas when he only focused on those verses, on the text that he wrote against the Mongols. It gives us a skewed perspective. But Ibn Qayyim, when he's talking about jihad in his non-legal writings, he's talking about sabr. He has a beautiful treatise on the merits of sabr, the fadail of sabr, which I talk about briefly in my book, Jihad, What Everyone Needs to Know, but I actually deal with it at greater length in my earlier publication, The Striving in the Path of God, Jihad and Martyrdom in Islamic Thought. There, Ibn Qayyim, just like al-Ghazali, talks about the virtues of the internal spiritual jihad. He doesn't call it jihad al-nafs. He's not using the later terminology. Neither is al-Ghazali. They use the Quranic word sabr. But that's exactly what they're describing. When you read the whole treatise, you know that they are describing the internal spiritual struggle of the human being, right? So there is absolutely no doubt that throughout Islamic history and in some of the major Islamic writings through the centuries, there was this continuous emphasis on the internal aspects of jihad. The terminology or the typology that develops in the later period has led some people to mistakenly say, and this includes some scholars or some people who claim to be academics, has led them to say, oh, there is no evidence for the jihad al-nafs in the early literature. None of the early hadiths or the Quran refers to jihad al-nafs in those very terms. They're right about that. But just because the terminology evolved later doesn't mean that the concept wasn't already there under a different name. If you look under the term sabr, you will find many more writings on sabr which describe the spiritual jihad, and the borrowing specifically terms from the Quran that describe this greater jihad, right? The jihad that everyone has to carry out all the time. And so absolutely, when we talk about jihad holistically, by that I mean when we talk about jihad in all its dimensions, we must include also a discussion of the military aspects of jihad under limited conditions. We need to also stress that there are only specific conditions under which you can carry out a military attack. And it's in the Quran, it's defensive. There's no doubt about that. In the Quran, it's strictly defensive. There's absolutely no justification given for attacking people just because they practice a different religious belief.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So another question that I have is just brings us to the modern era. So you explain these different views and how more radical views emerged in the modern era, and you brought up their refutations as well. But one thing that was interesting to me, if I understood correctly, was that you first emphasized the commentary of Muhammad Abduh and explained how he was actually against the idea of jihad as a holy war, and followed some of the like classical explanations on jihad as well. But the thing was, he used more quote-unquote modernist methods in his interpretation. But then some others who followed a similar methodology, like Faraj in your example, like using the emphasizing the naskh abrogation, they came up with an entirely different conclusion. So what I want to ask is, do you think there are always these possibilities for rather more radical interpretations of jihad? Like, or is it anyway possible to counterbalance these more radical explanations? I mean, obviously, your emphasis on some more mainstream scholars' interpretation on jihad, the modern scholars' interpretation of jihad was quite helpful. But do you think those interpretations will be able to counterbalance and maybe block further more radical explanations or interpretations of the concept of jihad?
Yeah, so the best way to counter those radical interpretations is to engage in a holistic discussion of jihad. So as soon as you bring in the principle of abrogation or naskh, that has become the favorite strategy of the radicals, right? Because what are they going to do with verses like Quran 68, in chapter 60, verse 8? With chapter 8, verse 61, which says, you know, if the opposite side agrees to lay down their weapons and resort to peacemaking, then you're also obligated to do that, right? And Quran 68 says you simply cannot attack people who are peaceful, even though they're not Muslims. You have to leave them alone and allow them to continue in their ways of life. So how do you get around these very unambiguous prescriptions in the Quran? So we see this already in the classical period, where some of the more belligerent jurists, I named Makhul al-Shami, who's very early during the Umayyad period. He supported the notion of abrogation and was one of the early people to advocate that Quran 9:5 can be understood to have abrogated Quran 68 and Quran 861 and other verses, right, that called for peacemaking. So I understand that there is already a classical precedent for it, and some of the militants are pointing to some of the legal literature where you do see some of these more belligerent interpretations already in the pre-modern period. So what Abduh and other modernist commentators are doing is pointing out that by invoking the principle of naskh, they're actually doing considerable harm, damage, the Quranic text. They are actually questioning the validity of certain verses that, according to Muslims, are part of the revelation, right? Are part of the divine revelation, and therefore all equally valid. So by insisting that the Quran be read as a holistic text, Abduh and other scholars like him, Juma, also Ali Jum, is also very critical of the radical militant thinkers, right? On the same basis. Muhammad Imara, whom I mentioned, who wrote his refutation of Faraj's treatise, al-Farida al-Ghaiba. All of them are stressing that jihad is a multivalent word. It's a word with many meanings. Its different dimensions become apparent in certain circumstances. The overriding meaning of jihad is this continuous human struggle. What are humans struggling for? Well, there's the basic ethical and moral imperative within Islam. You have to promote what is good, prevent what is wrong, right? The continuous struggle to promote what is good in every aspect of life is the ultimate and foundational meaning of jihad, right? The constant struggle that you wage inside yourself so that you don't give in to wrong temptations, that you don't give in to your impulses to do people harm, right? Again, that is part of the continuing human struggle. So from my vantage point, from my perspective, from my engagement with all these sources, it's clear that both the pre-modern scholars like al-Tabari, al-Razi, al-Qurtubi, all of whom denied that Quran 9:5 actually abrogated other verses in the Quran. Don't forget that these pre-modern scholars are also doing it. So it's not as if just Abduh himself, just because it's a modernist, is promoting this point of view. This point of view is already well established in the pre-modern classical exegesis itself, right? And I refer to that so that you could see that there is already a genealogy of ideas going back to the pre-modern period. So Abduh isn't stating anything new. He's not stating anything innovative. He's actually participating in the larger tradition of exegetes, Quran commentators, like al-Tabari and al-Zamakhshari, al-Razi and al-Qurtubi and many of the other, prominent commentators on the Quran. He's actually participating in that tradition of questioning some of the more militant interpretations that do considerable injustice to the Quran by insisting that we declare certain verses to be invalid and consider only certain verses to be valid, right? I mean, that's an extremely bold and foolhardy way, I would say, of engaging a text that Muslims are unanimous in asserting is a divine revelation, right? So to take that human, to arrogate to oneself as a human being the right to declare certain verses of the divinely revealed text to be abrogated, I think, it should fill us contemporary Muslims with great concern that they were able to assert that and even impose their views in a number of different spheres, right? So modern scholars, particularly reformist scholars in the modern contemporary periods, are revisiting this whole notion of naskh or abrogation, which in their from their perspective have actually done considerable damage to the understanding of jihad over time.
Thank you. So we have one question, and let me ask that question, and then maybe we can conclude after that. So it's a bit an out of the ordinary question, but it's an interesting one. So our follower asks the situation and the call for jihad in the context of the war between Russia and Ukraine, because one of the leading clerics in Russia, I guess from Chechnya, called the Russian invasion jihad. And I remember a couple of weeks ago, there was this article from Bob Cruz from Stanford. He was explaining that they saw this as a fight against NATO, fight against West, and fight for God, and that's why they call it jihad. But at the same time, there were Muslims in both sides, both in Russia and Ukraine, clearly rejecting this call as a jihad. So yes, in classical texts, like in Quran, jihad can even like even contain defense of non-Muslims as well. But is there any way, is there any interpretation that is possible for a cleric to make a like announcement of jihad for a situation like this?
I think this cleric needs basic education in Islamic doctrine. Okay.
I'm sure.
First of all, if jihad is defensive, you cannot carry it out as an aggressive activity. It's clear that Russia invaded Ukraine, right? And you also, there are very clear codes of conduct during the waging of warfare. You cannot attack civilians. Russian troops have been targeting primarily civilians, and their intent, actually, like the militants that we have in Muslim majority countries, some of the minority militant groups that we have, their whole purpose is to spread terror among the civilian population. Muslim jurists made a sharp distinction between a legitimate jihad, which can only be declared by a legitimate head of state. When such warfare is undertaken, you cannot hurt the civilian population. In fact, you need to go out of your way to protect civilians while hostilities are being carried out, right? So all these principles have been violated. So if the cleric has somehow managed to delude himself into thinking that this somehow qualifies for the term jihad, then again, I think we need to send him back to the first grade in a basic madrasa and have him learn some of the basic principles and doctrines that are clearly outlined in the Quran. Now, the Muslim jurists actually, when they dealt with people who insisted on spreading terror among civilians, they actually had a different name for it. It's haraba. It's haraba, right? It's not jihad, obviously, because it violates every principle that is associated with a legitimate military jihad. Now, there's nothing to stop Muslims from going around calling, whatever violent activity they engage in and naming that jihad, but other Muslims need to call them out. They need to challenge them and say, where are you getting your ideas from? Because this is absolutely deviant. This is not based on any foundational text within Islam, and it violates a whole history of principled legitimate warfare, the rules for conducting principled legitimate warfare that were carefully established by the classical scholars. So you have departed from the mainstream Islamic tradition by making such a bold statement at that. What you're indeed carrying out is haraba. You're a muharibun. You're among the muharibun, those who carry out haraba. And really, there's absolutely no way to justify it with the term jihad.
Yes, thank you very much. I actually not only send him to the first grade, I can recommend him to read your book, because your book, one of the great things about your book is that it is good for scholars, but at the same time for ordinary readers as well. So you're like posing questions and answering them in a very clear way. So even for a cleric like this can benefit from your book and understand the concept of jihad much better.
Maybe we can consider translating that into Russian for our cleric, or the Chechen language, and perhaps also maybe through your organization we can consider a Turkish translation.
Inshallah,
I really would like my book to be translated, particularly in other Islamic languages, because I think there is a need, primarily among Muslims, to understand their own sources themselves. Because otherwise, as you said, we do get, these crazy, rather ignorant statements coming out of certain circles that should be challenged.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we should be onto it, and hopefully we will see that in Turkish, in Arabic and Farsi, in other languages in the next couple of years as well.
Inshallah.
Thank you very much. This has been a great talk, and thanks for your time. And I'm sure I appreciate it a lot, and I'm sure the others will benefit a lot as well. Do you have any concluding remarks?
I just want to thank you and your organization for offering me this opportunity to address your audience. And I hope the audience benefited from my talk. And if you get any feedback, I would be very interested in learning about it. So thank you to you, to the lovely young lady who helped me with the technical issues, and your technical support person as well. I think.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day, and hope to see you again, and hope to listen to you again. Ramadan Mubarak.
Ramadan Mubarak to you.
Sure. Have a nice day.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.